I'd like to welcome everyone to this session of the conference on the Tudeh party at AT. It's a very important session. We have three speakers. The first speaker will be Khosrow Vakili, an independent scholar who's going to talk about the letters of Major Vakili. The second speaker will be Nasser Muhajir, who's going to talk about the Khosrow Roozbeh dossier, new findings, also an independent scholar. And the final speaker will be Siavush Ranjbar-Daimi, who I'm sure needs no introduction and has been the organizer of this very interesting and significant event. So each speaker will have 20 to 25 minutes for their presentation, and then we will move to question and answer. So if you could, as usual, submit your questions either through the chat facility or the Q&A, and we'll go straight into that. So first of all, let me welcome Khosrow Vakili and ask him to give his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the organizers of the conference. My talk has two parts. One part that has a very narrow focus, mostly focuses on the 6 letters that Major Vakili managed to write in prison and pass along undetected to his wife, Turan Mirhadi, in the last 10 days of his life. The other component, by the way, apparently the letters in PDF form is available for people to download and read on their own time. The other component of my talk relates to the historiography of the Tudeh party about Major Vakili, and to a lesser degree about his wife, Turan Mirhadi. I should also say at the outset that Jafar and Turan are my parents, but as I point out in the abstract of my talk, I'll try to mostly stay out of their way and let them speak for themselves. The historiography of the Tudeh party spans different time periods. It starts in, I believe, late 1950s, 1960. Then it gets repeated in 1979, 1980. We'll have that period. And finally, a short period in 2017 as it relates to these two people. For this reason, I have broken my talk into 4 parts. The first one is the famous poem. Then I talk about the letters themselves. Then I talk about what happened when these letters were published in Iran after the revolution of 1979. And I end with a laudatory tribute that takes place in 2017. As I switch between these times, I'll point that out. So I'll start with the first part, poem of Jafar Vakili. I've noticed that leaders of Tudeh party after the coup d'etat of 1953 often have referred to the party as a party of heroes and have vigorously promoted these heroes in different activities and publications of the party. There's one particular publication that talks about these, is called Yadname Shahidan, or In Memory of the Martyrs. And Major Vakili is considered as one of these heroes, and one page in that document is devoted to him. I'm not exactly sure about the date of publication of that. The version I've seen is 1974 or 75, but I'm certain that there's another version of that that appeared earlier. So the central part of this piece about Major Vakili is a poem that is claimed that he wrote on the wall of his prison cell, and that it was discovered after he was executed. I'll quote part of this poem soon, but let me point out that for years, Major Vakili has been mostly known by his association with this poem. So this poem has been published in various publications of Tudeh Party. They have read it on some of their radio programs at different times. I personally saw it for the first time in a meeting of the Confederation of Iranian Students at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it was written on a large poster and was hanging on the wall. This was in 1978. It was also some years later, someone pointed out to me that there's a paper titled Myths and Facts in Iranian Historiography that was published in 1999, and there's a reference to Jafar Vakili in that. The author of that paper is considering the myths about who wrote the famous Iranian poem, Kiss Me, or Mara Bebus, and he briefly considers Major Vakili as a possible author. Let me quote that. Indeed, only Major Jafar Vakili, with his famous poem that insults the Shah, had any claim to poetry. Now let me go to the poem. I only read the last two stanzas. And let me also say that from my point of view, this is a crude poem and it is crudely translated by me. So here it goes. If you, O Shah, deliver me and my beautiful wife at dawn the gift of a few molten lead flowers, namely bullets, or trample on our heads and chests with a horse, or get drunk on our blood instead of wine, and now here comes the main message of the poem. So that stanza is finished. In the morning of tomorrow, my son will sing, praise be on the vigilance of my father's party. So I personally have always doubted that this poem was written by him. A few years ago, I read his letters very carefully as we were preparing it for publication in a publication in Iran. And I then was certain that he was not the author of this poem. The message of the poem is not simply different or contrary to what is in his letters, it is diametrically opposed to it. So let me give you one quote from his letters. So he says, we were crème de la crème of the army that are perishing as a result of carelessness and mistakes of our leaders. We are ourselves also responsible, but the responsibility of our carelessness also lays with the leaders who did not train us to be vigilant. So I doubt that he wants then somebody to praise the vigilance of the party. Then later in 2017, I talked to someone who had direct knowledge, and he said for certainty that this is not a poem that he wrote. So in some ways, one can say that that whole page in Memoirs of the Martyrs is totally fabricated and does not represent Major Vakili at all. So now let me move on to part two that focuses on the letters. Let me first give you some background about him. He was born in 1923, was an officer in the Iranian army. He joined the party and became a member of its military organization in 1948. He was sent by the army to France in 1950 for training. That's where he meets Turan Mirhadi. When he returned to Iran in 1950-51, he was selected to the 6th member leadership secretariat of the military organization of the party, and he was in charge of training and education. After the coup, for a period of time, the party considered organizing armed resistance to the regime. He was a member of a small committee charged with this investigation, and he specifically was in charge of military training and education and securing arms and ammunition. Let me also say that another member of that committee was the very active member of the Central Committee of the party, Nureddin Kianuri, who will appear again later in my talk. The party at some point decided that actually arms resistance was not feasible, and they abandoned this effort. He was arrested in August of 1954. He was tried in a group of 12 officers. They went through 2 trials. In both cases, they were all sentenced to death by execution. Then they had, by law, an appeal period of 10 days, during which they could appeal the last decision, the final decision. And it was during these 10 days that for the first time they could meet with their families. And during this time, he managed to write 6 letters on cigarette papers that he borrowed from his comrades, and managed to also pass on these letters to Turan during the visits. 5 of these letters are addressed to Turan, and the last one is addressed to the Central Committee of the party, and specifically to Hossein, which was nom de guerre of Nureddin Kianuri. Turan was visiting him in prison as his sister because he had not revealed the fact that he was married and had a child. He was executed on November 8th, 1954. At this point, the original copies of the letters are at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. These are the first 5 letters because this last letter was given to Kianuri, and that is, we don't know where that letter is, if it exists now. But a copy of that letter was written down by Turan Mirhadi, so what will appear is from that copy. So now what I would like to do is highlight some of the items in that he managed to do that are in the letters. One of the preoccupations of these officers at the time was to discover, to find out how this secret military organization was discovered, and they considered that there may have been a betrayal from inside. And given that Khosrow Roozbeh was the only member of the leadership who was not arrested, naturally, he became the chief suspect. There are references to that discussion related to the references in the letter to that discussion related to the suspicion. Now we know it turned out that that suspicion was unfounded. Roozbeh remained active and was arrested and executed in 1958, and he's considered actually as one of the most revered historical figures of the Iranian left. So the next topic that he talks about a number of times is what he considers the weakness in the party and as it relates to the leadership of the party. And I quote here now from him. So he says, comrades of the Central Committee and Executive Committee of the party, are drowning in their own personal grudges and interested calculations. They often compromise the interests of the movement and subordinate it to their own interests. I'm not saying this only now that I'm in prison. They were repeatedly criticized, but they did not listen. Unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you everything. You may imagine that I'm very upset because I'm being executed. Not at all. In another section, he says, on many occasions, we expressed strong criticism, said that the leadership should be strengthened, and proposed various solutions, but they responded that there was no need for it, that the party was well led, and that under the circumstances, it was not possible to do any better. In one meeting, I made a serious proposal that a system of control from below be established, and that the Central Committee give us its plan for the future and a report of its past activities. The other comrades, while they agreed with me, did not follow up. And Azar, this is a person who was a contact with the Central Committee, despite my repeating the proposal, ignored it and gave a non-answer. Another topic, another notion that appears time and again in his letters is this notion of responsibility. And it's a bit different from the way sometimes responsibilities in political organizations are articulated. So let me read you a couple of items from his letters. It says, I should have resigned then, since while I'm not directly responsible for this disaster, I'm somewhat responsible. When they were torturing the comrades in their cells and their cries of pain would rise up, it was as if they were twisting a knife in my heart. I only came to understand the meaning of responsibility when it was too late. These same comrades would blow kisses to me the next day as I passed in front of their cells, which itself was very painful to me. In another place, this is understood the meaning of responsibility when they read me the execution sentence of a simple member of one of the branches. Then he's giving suggestions to Ron. He says, I think as long as the status of the Central Committee has not become clear and they have not shown that they are willing to respond properly to criticism and proven in practice that they can reliably lead the movement, you should reconsider continuing your activities blindly. This is very important, and that is the notion of responsibility as it relates to you, not as it relates to you, but as it relates to the people who are active under you. You should feel this responsibility deeply in your being and not take it lightly. Only after my death and remembering all the unforgettable times we had together, that I'm sure will be extremely painful for you for the rest of your life, and remembering what talented people have perished and what families were destroyed, only then will you fully realize what it means to be careless with responsibility and with properly leading those who have innocently put their fates in the hands of leaders. So it's a notion of responsibility directed to actually people who are members and not directed towards the leadership. Then in contrast to how the Tudeh party has dealt with martyrs, so-called, he says the following. He says to Turan, you told me that one of the benefits of our tragedy is that the name of people like Atarod will become immortal. Atarod was one of the officers who was executed in the previous group. Then he says, only those who have not yet learned the true lessons of our disaster and have not yet fully understood the meaning of responsibility and take the future of the movement too lightly would say such things. So he sort of undermines this notion of heroes and hero worship. The next item that I want to quote from his letters relates to women's organization, the women organization of the Tudeh party. It was interesting to me that in the last days of his life, he's actually making a detailed suggestion in this context. So maybe before, and it's also interesting in light of what discussed on Tuesday at the talks on Tuesday and women's organization. So let me, before that, first introduce Turan here and her activities. She was born in 1927, went to University of Tehran for 1 year, during which she was radicalized, then went to Europe, ended up in Paris, and studied educational psychology in Paris for 4 years. She became active in the last years there, and she joined the Women's International Democratic Federation. In fact, she was hired by them for a year in Paris, for some time in Paris. I don't know exactly the time. And then when the offices of the YIDF was moved to East Berlin, she moved there and she was there for 1 year. She returned to Iran in 1951-52 and joined the women's organization of the Tudeh party. Turan has not herself talked much about her activities in the women's party in detail. I just found something in the memoirs of Maryam Firuz, how much one can trust that. And she's asked, you and Turan Mirhadi had a lot of disagreements. What was that about? So she comments on that, but says that Turan and I did not have many disagreements. Then she says that in those days, Dr. Yazdi was very much against me, and he was very revengeful and wanted in one way or another to take responsibilities away from me. And one day he brought Turan Mirhadi and introduced her as the person in charge of the women's organization. That was news to me, that I knew that she was in the women's organization, but at this level, if it's true, I did not know. So going back to Jafar's comment about suggestions for the women's organization, he makes the following suggestions. I think you will be exposed to less danger and you will advance more rapidly if the organization, namely the women's organization, severs its ties with the party at the level of local committees and stays in touch with the party only at the level of central committee with someone like Zareh. And if Zareh does not allow meddling in the affairs of the organization, that would turn it into an appendix of the party that he considers is a wrong thing to do. In reality, the goal is to become a much more independent organization and follow the directives of the federation, that's the International Women's Federation, to develop plans for expansion and advocacy. Try more and more to use legal forms of struggle. If under the current circumstances, it is difficult to organize around achieving a particular demand, there exists ample basis for awakening and alerting women to their basic rights, which is the first step on the road to struggle. Put your energies in such efforts. So I have now done my quotes from the letters. The letters are much more expansive. There are other things in them. And it's available to people if they want to read. Once, then in 1979, after the revolution, Turan decided to publish these letters for the first time in Iran. She removed the parts that were critical of some of the members of the party. Those parts from the letters were removed. The argument was that these people are not alive anymore to be able to respond and defend themselves. And also at the moment right after Iranian Revolution, it was not appropriate to focus on those parts, but by removing those, then she published them. So then there was there was an exchange between the Tudeh party at the time and Turan Mir Hadi. Tudeh party in one of his in its main journal, Name Mardom, wrote a long piece about these letters, and maybe I should read you first this part. So it's titled "The Disgraceful Attempts of the Slanderers to Tarnish the Honor of the Martyrs." Recently, a pamphlet called Letters from Prison has been published, which, according to its publisher, contains a collection of letters that the martyred Comrade Major Jafar Vakili, the secretary of the military officers organization of the Tudeh party, had written to his wife from his prison cells in the last day of his life. By publishing this dubious collection, the publisher is attempting to make it appear as if our martyred comrade, who according to his last letter, even on the last day of his life, before being executed, speaks with admiration, love, and affection for his party and its leadership, and expresses his unwavering loyalty to them, reportedly after his arrest and enduring the first sessions of torture, loses his self-confidence, starts having doubts about the party, and advises his wife to stay away from the party activities. But when the reader reads the collection to the end and compares the letters with the last letter of the martyred Comrade Vakili, which is addressed to Dear Hossein, the reader begins to doubt the authenticity of the collection and asks, then it's some. So I skipped that part. The last letter of Comrade Martyr Jafar Vakili, as the reader can see below, is addressed to Dear Hossein, while the publisher has tried to present the letters as if they're against the totality of the leadership of the party, and of course against its current leadership. Due to the publisher's misfortune, she has not realized that this Dear Hossein is Comrade Nureddin Kianuri, the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Tudeh Party of Iran. Indeed, the contents of the last letter exposes the slanderers and openly condemns the intention and motives of the publisher of the collection. Despite these unfortunate efforts, the Tudeh Party of Iran continues to consider the life and heroic efforts of the martyred Comrade Jafar Vakili among its honors and the honors of the national liberation movement of our country, and judges and values him based on his last letter that was written on the last day of his life. So in some ways, Jafar Vakili managed to pass these letters undetected from prison, but he did not manage to have all the letters pass the censorship of the Tudeh party. Turan Mir Hadi then responded in the second issue, when the letters were published again, is that in fact, and this was known, that she was in touch with Nureddin Kianuri and she personally gave the last letter to her, and she knew exactly who she was giving it to. And the other part that she mentions is the letter to the Central Committee is in fact the logical consequence of the first to fifth letter, in which weaknesses, betrayals, incorrect approaches, partiality, and absence of a sense of responsibility are raised, and at the same time, the text provides the necessary warnings to the party in the form of recommendations to prevent it from disintegrating. Therefore, the first to fifth letter not only do not contradict the letter to the Central Committee, but they document it. Maybe I see that my time may be short, so maybe I should stop right now. If necessary, at other times, I'll comment on.
If you would like to take a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes to conclude, please do so.
Okay, sure. Okay. So it's instructive to read the letter to the Central Committee. So this is a letter that actually was given to the party, but to the party was never published yet. And you will find that the beginning of the letter, he's commenting on the fact that he's so maybe actually I'll very quickly read this letter. I'm writing this letter in the final days of my life on behalf of martyrs of the party to the comrades of the Central Committee. Our comrades remain loyal to you and the party to the end. We are saddened by our death for some reason and happy by it for others. We are saddened because we can no longer be useful to the party, and happy because we are dying a very honorable death. You should not judge the comrades based on what they said during the trials. They misinterpreted the directive of the party that they should renounce the party after being arrested. The 6 members who were executed last week were in good spirits, and before the harrowing screech of the bullets tearing through their bodies reached us, the sound of them chanting slogans moved and excited us. So that's they resisted and they didn't recount. Hold dear the memory of the martyrs, comfort their bereaved families, and help prevent the disintegration of their families as much as possible. Now comes actually his criticism that is posed as recommendation. Consider the following as our last words or will. No fascism. Prepare the party for harder blows and take all necessary precautions. Fight vigorously against spies and traitors and consider this as one of your most important responsibilities. Be ever more careful in selecting members and leaders. Encourage a system of control, in particular control from below, and allow it to flourish. Strengthen the leadership in any way you know. Subordinate any personal interests to the interests of the party. Be role models and living examples in this regard. To the extent possible, regularly provide a report of your past activities and your future plan to the lower organs of the party and ask them to discuss and criticize them. Make a serious attempt to improve the training of yourselves and that of other comrades. Expand and promote collective leadership in the party. I repeat one more time, again, a better and better understanding of fascism and gain a better and better understanding of fascism and prepare the party for a struggle in a fascistic environment. Tomorrow we will bravely face the firing squad and we'll die with complete confidence in your eventual victory. On behalf of the martyrs, I shake your hands warmly and wholeheartedly and embrace you to your success. So this letter was originally not published by the Tudeh party because it not so veiled terms is actually critical of the past weak behavior of the leadership of the party. So maybe I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. It was a fascinating and very poignant talk, and I think it will generate many questions that I can see them already coming up. So thank you very much for that. We'll come back. And let's go straight to Nasser Muhajir, who's going to talk about the Khosrow Roozbeh dossier, new findings. Nasser, thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Stephanie, and I would like to welcome everyone who's listening to this talk, and I try to be brief. The name of the article is Khosrow Roozbeh, Villain or Hero. What follows is a brief biographical account of Khosrow Roozbeh. It presents a different approach and contains new information with regards to the sparse biographies we have of him in English, such as the one prepared by Dr. Abbas Milani, and of most accounts that we have in Persian. I will discuss the problem with sources related to Roozbeh's life later in my talk. I wish to make one key point. Roozbeh's biography still contains many unknown points. For example, we don't know the exact year in which Roozbeh joined the Tudeh party, or the date he became a member of the military organization of that party, or his feuds and few splits with the party. So the account below contains some gaps which we might be able to address in the future, but can't do as of now. Khosrow Roozbeh was born in 1913 in the small city of Malayer in northwest of Iran. His father, Muhammad Hussein, was a dignified and incorruptible military officer who, after assuming the directorship of the bigger Malayer gendarmerie, decided to resign from Reza Shah's army and take a middle-ranking job in the treasury. Consequently, he and his family had to live a frugal life. Nonetheless, he cared for his three sons' education. Khosrow, a brilliant student, was sent off to Hamadan to enroll in the prominent Pahlavi school. Khosrow Roozbeh, a math prodigy and a great talent, finished high school in 2 years' time with honors degree. Lacking the means to support his higher education in the Department of Science of the University of Tehran, he had to abandon his beloved mathematics and instead register in the Officers' Academy of Tehran. There, he was admitted to study in the prestigious artillery section, reserved for the more intellectually advanced cadets. It was at this time that he polished his English and French and started writing and translating texts on military matters. Upon graduation from the Officers' Academy in 1937, Roozbeh was invited to teach at the Military Academy of Tehran. He soon proved to be a distinguished instructor and a prolific writer. The outbreak of World War II, the invasion of Iran by the Allied forces, the abdication of Reza Shah, and the subsequent restoration of political freedoms shook the army more than any other institution in the Iranian society. This important pillar of state control over society was badly affected by the desertion of numerous conscripts, soldiers, and even high-ranking officers. The young and inexperienced Mohammad Reza Shah had little room for maneuverability in the face of the expanding crisis in the armed forces. Neither were his hand-picked chiefs of staff who replaced one another. This peculiar situation made the apolitical Iranian society the product of Reza Shah's all-out repression, interested in politics once again. Khosrow Roozbeh too followed political events and developments alongside an intense study of political theory, Marxism, history, and literature. This enhanced and enriched his writings on ballistics, heavy guns and their trajectories, anti-missiles, and so on, as well as his scholarly presentations, which came to be quite popular in the military academy and university environments. By 1945, he had published 8 books on military matters, a short history of the Second World War, another book on scientific methods to solve geometrical problems, and also 2 books on how to learn and play chess. Indeed, it needs to be mentioned that Roozbeh was a maestro in chess and officially the #1 chess player in the entire country. Khosrow Roozbeh went into hiding after General Hassan Arfa, a renowned Anglophile, was appointed as the Army Chief of Staff in 1945 and launched his witch hunt in the armed forces, sending tens of left-leaning officers into internal exile. It was during his first clandestine life, September 23rd, 1945 until July 11th, 1946, that he penned his most seminal work, Blind Obedience. This polemical monograph was first published in the spring of 1946, became a bestseller, was republished several times and reviewed by the major news outlets of the time. A fusion of his life story and a critical overview of Reza Shah's era, Blind Obedience identified colonialism as the root cause of underdevelopment, misery, and poverty of the colonized and semi-colonized nations. Roozbeh characterizes Reza Shah's tenure as the age of dictatorship and decline of the Iranian nation. He vehemently criticizes the structure of the Iranian army, the inhumanly stern military discipline, and the corruption of the high brass, particularly the Arfa clique. Roozbeh not only debunks the ruling classes and existing institutions, but goes further and draws his demarcation line with the Tudeh party. Most probably, he is the first in the Iranian left who spoke disparagingly of the Tudeh party. Quote, "In my opinion, the Tudeh party is, as the French say, a reformist party. In other words, the Tudeh party of Iran aspires to gradually change the dire situation of the country and the plight of the people through parliament. Whereas I'm infatuated with revolution and plead to settle account with the ruling class by a revolution." A few months after a normal life, resumption of teaching in the officers' academy, authoring and co-authoring new books, including the first Persian dictionary of political, philosophical, and economic terms, فرهنگ لغات و اصطلاحات فلسفی، اقتصادی و سیاسی, writing on socio-political events in the legal press, including نامه مردم, People's Daily, albeit through the pseudonym Setakhr, Gunnery Lieutenant Khosrow Roozbeh. Yet a couple of weeks after being promoted to major in March 1947, he was arrested and imprisoned by the military police. In about a month, some of his comrades and sympathizers feared that Roozbeh would suffer the same fate as the 21 officers who were executed in January of that year on trumped-up charges of planning an armed insurrection. They succeeded to have him escape from prison after a month. This breaking news was immediately diffused throughout the country. Roozbeh was court-martialed in absentia, ousted from the army, and condemned to 15 months of imprisonment. Therefore, May 8, 1947, marks the commencement of Roozbeh's second clandestine life. In this new phase of his life, he took some important initiatives. Furious at the Tudeh party leadership, who dissolved the military organization after the Shah's army crushed the autonomous state of Azerbaijan, he entered into negotiations with a few influential leaders of the organization, which culminated in the creation of the Organization of Iran's Free Officers. He continued writing and translating books, Scientific and Utopian Socialism, Fundamental Principles of Philosophy, The Game of Love and Death, Rose France. His future, it is during this very time that he fell in love with Afaq Rast Kar, his future spouse. It is also in this period that two loyalist newspapers, Atash and Nejat, named Khosrow Roozbeh as the likely assassin of the fiery anti-establishment journalist Mohammad Masood, who was murdered on 12 February 1948. It was widely rumored at the time that the court, and specifically Ashraf Pahlavi thugs, were involved in the crime. Khosrow Roozbeh's hideout was detected sometime in April 1948 and raided by the police on April 6th of that year. He was humiliated, mistreated, tortured, not permitted visitation, and deprived of basic rights. Roozbeh exposes these atrocities in the first session of his closed-door trial, held on May 4th, that somehow leaked to the press. As a result, the successive sessions became open to the public and the press. It is in court that he finds out, in effect, he's being arrested because of having uttered blind obedience, even though his indictment contained one, disrespect for the chief of the country, I don't know what that means, and second, encouraging military personnel to desert the armed forces. Roozbeh's detailed defense and rejection of these fabricated charges was so effective, sturdy, and substantial that public opinion turned against the military court and called for Roozbeh's release. At one point he said, and I quote, "It has become clear that the honored prosecutor has either not observed the law when writing the bill of indictment or has committed a mistake. Specifically, it is not clear what kind of evidence the prosecutor has selected for what kind of misdeed. This itself is of importance, as it either stems from negligence or rush in preparing the indictment. Yet with regards to the charge of having encouraged desertions, opposing the state and humiliating the higher ups, the evidence of the interrogator is blind obedience," unquote. On May 2nd, 1948, the court condemned Roozbeh to 4 years of imprisonment. This was immediately contested by the defense team. All independent or left-leaning newspapers, public intellectuals, and even Majlis deputies. They unambiguously found the trial unfair and the verdict unjust. To everyone's surprise, the Court of Appeal that was convened after an interval of almost 3 weeks in a tense atmosphere and under the gaze of a multitude of city dwellers, condemned Roozbeh to 15 years of imprisonment and hard labor. This verdict was not easily accepted by the society at large. And for almost a month, it became the major theme of discussions amongst the people in the street, intellectuals in the cafes, and the deputies in the Majlis. They openly opposed the ruling and called for the release of the patriotic scholar. The publication and unprecedented large circulation of all 3 defense bills of Khosrow Roozbeh in the preliminary court, the Court of Appeal, and his final defense made Khosrow Roozbeh a national personality with great popular appeal. In detention, he continued his intense study of theoretical and literary texts, translating and corresponding with his comrades in the Organization of Iran's Free Officers. He also married Afaq in Qasr prison. A year after the start of his sentence, the Tudeh party and all its affiliated organizations are outlawed after an unsuccessful attempt on the Shah's life on the 4th of February 1949. Many of the leaders of the party, along with tens of its cadres, were arrested and detained. However, Roozbeh and other members of the Organization of Iran's Free Officers effectively managed to free the Tudeh leadership from Qasr prison in a spectacular operation on December 15, 1950. The big escape makes Roozbeh a living legend and the #1 enemy of the Pahlavi state. With the escape starts the third clandestine life of Khosrow Roozbeh. It lasts until his ultimate arrest in 1957. Throughout this period, Roozbeh leads the Organization of Iran's Free Officers from underground. With the 1953 coup d'etat, which changed the destiny of Iran, a reign of terror swept the country. The Tudeh party and all its affiliated organizations were the first and foremost targets of the regime that was backed by US administration and the British government. The Organization of Iran's Free Officers was severely hit in 1954. Most of its top officers were arrested, severely tortured, and executed by firing squad, as we learned from Jafar Vakili's speech. It's important to note that the security forces and their CIA advisors could not get their hands on Khosrow Roozbeh. After several members of the executive committee of the Tudeh party were arrested on 15th February 1956, and the rest left Iran for Moscow in the same year, the leadership of the party effectively fell in the hands of a group of 3, including Khosrow Roozbeh. It was one of the 3, Ali Muttaqi, who after his arrest surrounded and led Savak agents to his rendezvous with Khosrow Roozbeh. In the ensued shootout, Roozbeh was badly wounded in the chest and his right leg. He got arrested after hours of resistance. As soon as Savak arrested Roozbeh on July 6, 1957, an elaborate process starts in Iran's press. Newspapers such as Etela'at, Dad, and magazines such as Tehran Musaddar and Khandaniha, which were always willing and ready to publish Savak material, started to provide a sensational account of Roozbeh's alleged deeds. Parroting Azmudeh's press release, they mixed truth with lies to recite stories about his escapes from jail, membership and leadership of the communist formations, opposing constitutional monarchy, espionage activities, heading the intelligence branch of the military organization of Tudeh party, murdering 5 sellouts and ex-members of the Tudeh party, etc. Interestingly enough, not a word was uttered about Roozbeh's role in the assassination of Mohammad Massoud. It was only in December 1957 when the military prosecutor, Iskandar Azmudeh, held a press conference in which he suddenly claimed that according to Roozbeh's interrogations, he is the person who organized and executed the plan to assassinate Massoud. In this way, Savak finds a convenient solution to a riddle which had remained unresolved since 1948. When the Fadayan Islam leaders were arrested in November 24, 1955, General Bakhtiar, the head of Savak, and subsequently Etela'at, claimed that Fadayan Islam were responsible for Massoud's murder. Now the blame was transferred over to Roozbeh with a great acrobatic leap from Fadayan Islam to Roozbeh. Azmudeh's claims formed the basis of Savak's later accounts in the book Communism in Iran that he wrote, a book prepared by the senior Savak officer Ali Zibai in 1964, but never published or distributed to the public before the revolution. There was extensive quotes from what are depicted as Roozbeh's confessions. Zibai and Savak never published Roozbeh's confessions. Then quote him, quote him, and these quotes provide an extensive account of how a so-called 8-person group, which revolved around Roozbeh, decided to kill Masoud and the steps they took in this regard in 1948. At the same time in which Azmudeh makes his claims, Nasrullah Shifte, a former journalist of Bakhtar Emroz newspaper, started a series on Tehran Musawwar magazine, which had known links to military intelligence, in which he too starts repeating the same type of claim. Roozbeh is the killer of Masoud, he claims. The same Shifte had previously written that it was Fadayan Islam, Fadayan Islam's leader, Nawab Safavi, who was the mastermind of the assassination of Muhammad Masoud. Zibai's account has often been adopted as a reputable historical source in both Western and Iranian accounts of Roozbeh's life. But his work requires a closer scrutiny. In 1967, on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of Roozbeh's execution, Khandaniha magazine printed the first extensive publicly available set of Roozbeh's alleged confessions. The 7-part series appears similar to the contents of Zibai's book, but upon closer inspection, very important differences emerge. Unfortunately, we do not have the opportunity to delve into this subject here. Neither Khandaniha nor Zibai provide any document and just display printed text instead. In March 3rd, 1977, newspaper Etela'at started a new series called 28 Roos of Tarikh Iran Jahan, in which it offers nearly 900 pages of historical narrative as supplementary pages to the newspaper. On January 12, 1977, 28,000 Roos insert was dedicated to Masoud murder, and it reproduced the communique issued by the journalist syndicate in the days after the murder. Muhammad Musaddiq is mentioned, but no Khosrow Roozbeh. A few weeks later, on March 3rd, 1977, Etela'at sensationally announces the publication of Khosrow Roozbeh's confession. Regarding Masoud on its front page, the 28,000 Roos insert notes that a few weeks ago, when publishing the item regarding Masoud, the newspaper had done the error of not mentioning Roozbeh. Some friends, that is Sabak, had alerted Etela'at of its mistake and had provided some sheets from Roozbeh's alleged interrogation. This issue of Etela'at contains the first known example of handwritten interrogation reports pertaining to Roozbeh being published. A close inspection of them and comparison with other handwriting samples of Roozbeh in my possession reveals that the parts relevant to Masoud murder are not in Roozbeh's handwriting. They have been written by others who are trying to masquerade themselves as Roozbeh. One conclusion: what emerges from all this is that none of the various Sabak accounts of Roozbeh's role in Masoud's killing stack up with each other. They represent considerable differences and inconsistencies to the extent that it can be believed that they're all doctored in one way or another. The ease with which many scholars inside and outside Iran have attributed this killing to Roozbeh must be questioned. Other sources are also pointing in this direction. For example, the extended letter that Nasser Saremi, an alleged member of the Roozbeh group of 8, wrote when he was living in East Germany and the Tudeh party. He attacks Kianuri heavily, but makes no mention of this alleged group of Roozbeh. A fuller account of Roozbeh's case will be provided in a book which will contain a fully documented narrative together with other previously unseen sources, which Tudeh Books in Paris will publish in a couple of months' time. I do not know if I have time for reviewing my sources, or it should be done later on.
We can perhaps return to this in the Q&A if you can conclude. Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Nasser. Again, there are many issues raised by this fascinating talk, and I look forward to the Q&A where we can go into some issues perhaps a little more deeply. Thank you very much. And we'll move on immediately to Siavush Ranjbardemi, who's going to talk to us from Khosrow Roozbeh to Hafizullah Amin, the Tudeh Party of Iran and the Partito Comunista Italiano, 1976 to 79. Siavush.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and good afternoon, everyone. I will just share my PowerPoint. Just a moment. I hope everybody can see it. So I will confess that my talk really straddles sort of three different panels of this conference. The transnational one that we saw on Tuesday, this panel, and also the following one. It stems out of my research on the links between what I consider to be two of the most important non-Eastern Bloc communist parties of the 1960s and the 1970s in the Cold War period. Of course, the Partito Comunista Italiano, which we can briefly say was probably the most influential political party, communist political party of the Western Bloc, and our own Tudeh party. What I'm showing on this slide is basically the high point of this relationship, in my view. On the 23rd of October, 1976, there was the inauguration of a statue dedicated to Roozbeh in the city of Fiano Romano, that was the residence of the sculptor Reza Oulia, had a local PC administration. And this is probably, I think, the only statue in the world that was ever really inaugurated in honor of an Iranian communist leader, whether in Iran or elsewhere. The Tudeh and the PC in the decades before that had really very rich and deep ties. And if you go back to the, for example, Mossadegh period, the Italian Communist Party had a keen interest in what was going on in Iran between 1951 and 1953. It was in that period that the head of the PC's women organization, Maria Antonietta Macciocchi, travels to Iran in the summer of 1951. She writes a very interesting travelogue and is probably the only communist, and I think certainly the only female communist, that actually interviews personally both Mossadegh and Koshani. And her interviews are published in Unità. And the travelogue contains the backstage to this. And here you see a photo from her book, which shows Parvaneh Shirinlu, the very famous Tudeh young woman whose foot went under a tank, and she became a very important cause célèbre at that point in time. And Maria Antonietta Macciocchi went and actually visited her on her hospital bed. Fast forward to 1976. In the 1970s, there was really the apex of the relationship between these two parties. And it was due to a series of factors. First of all, there was a very important Tudeh presence in Italy led by Mehrdad Farjad. They were very active in the Iranian opposition circles in Italy. They were very active in keeping a relationship with Italian leftist parties. The Tudeh first secretary of the time, Iraj Eskandari, was somebody who was very amenable to he was a kind of leader that was very popular with the Western communists. And particularly, he had a very personal rapport with Enrico Berlinguer, who was, of course, the very important first secretary of the PC. And this was the background to this statue of Khosrow Roozbeh. That was really, from what I found in the archives of the PC in Rome, was really an initiative that came out of the Italian side more than the Iranian side. Reza Oulia had this idea, this local administration supported him, and then the Tudeh was invited for the inauguration. And the inauguration was something quite remarkable because there were a lot of Italian partisans of the Second World War, of course, were still alive at that time, including the former leader of the PC, Luigi Longo, or Umberto Terracini, who was one of the framers of Italy's post-World War II constitution. Escandari was there himself. And you have all these interesting messages. For example, the former Italian president, Giuseppe Saragat, he was mentioning Roozbeh, or Pietro Nenni, the former comrade of Benito Mussolini, who then became the president of the Italian Socialist Party. He is also talking about the oppression and how Fiano Romano is sort of being coming out in solidarity with the oppression of the Iranian people. Or, for example, Renato Guttuso, a very important Italian painter. He was the one who designed the logo of the PC. And again, he is praising Reza Ouliya and Roozbeh. So it was a moment in which really this idea that Roozbeh is one of us, he's in the mold of the partisans of World War II, comes to the fore and creates this bond between these two parties. However, it goes downhill from there. It goes better uphill from there. That was the high point, as I said. And what starts to become problematic is the revolution. This was 1976. Of course, the revolution happens between 1978 and 1979. And it is the evolution of the revolution that really brings some friction between the two. So during the revolution, the PC was very active in trying to understand what was going on. It had two signature publications, Unità, the daily of the Central Committee, and then Rinascita, that was this intellectual journal, which was a sort of much more polished and elaborate version of the Tudeh's Donia, for example, magazine. These were the points that they were coming up with in their analysis of the revolution. They saw a hegemonic role for the clergy straight away. They realized the originality of this Iranian revolution. And here you see from the 15th of December, 1978, Rinascita claiming that Quran, Robespierre, and Marx, there is this cauldron of ideas in the immense crowd of Tehran with these very famous photographs. And then when the revolution happens, they bring out Gramsci's old title, La rivoluzione contro il capitale, the revolution against capital, and there's a sort of a new edition of Gramsci's analysis of the Bolshevik revolution that comes to the fore. At the same time, there is, from the autumn onwards, Sigmund Ginsberg, the Unità journalist, who becomes in charge of the Iran file, goes to Iran. He comes out with exceptional reporting. For example, he has a very interesting account of the strike, the oil strike of Abadan, from Abadan. He goes there with a Le Monde journalist, and this report in Unità is much better than the Le Monde one. At the same time, however, in Italy, there are contrasts. So, for example, one of the important leaders of the Iranian opposition in Italy, Rahmat Khosravi, he writes this article on the worker class question on Unità, and he mentions the Tudeh's errors in the past. And this causes the Tudeh to send a furious letter to the PC and telling them to never again publish something by Rahmat Khosravi, who is a renegade member of the left. So Ginsberg, as I said, was the correspondent of Unità. His reports will be published in the newspapers, but he also produced secret reports for the head of the PC's Foreign Affairs Department. And the PC was running like a state within the state, pretty much. It was always convinced that it had a good chance of gaining power in Italy. So it was ready. It had a sort of very extensive international department. And these reports are quite interesting because they have some rather caustic views on what's going on in Iran. So the first report that I found in the archives is from the 18th of December, 1978. There's this sort of bird's eye view of what's going on with the left of Iran, 30 leftist groups. The Tudeh is not dominant like the 1950s. He has contact with what was then the Open Organization, the Ittihad Demokratik Mardom, led by Beazin. And his view is that the organization at theoretical level appears to be very weak. There's a lack of the capacity to propose a unifying initiative for the left. The left was seen as a combination of ideologically sectarian groups. And of course, this is Ginsberg. He's somebody who's been trained really in this very extensive sort of bureaucracy that the PC had. So for him, the sort of very primordial situation in which the Iranian left finds itself in at the end of 1978 is really a sign of weakness. Moving forward, he mentions the Tudeh, and he says that the Tudeh exists, it's active in universities, factories, intellectual circles. Part of the Tudeh insiders are critical of the Berlin leadership. This is, of course, the exiled leadership of the Tudeh that's still in East Germany. And these are the mistakes that the Tudeh rank and file, the survivors of the Tudeh organization of the 50s mentioned. Lack of support from Mossadegh, not having lifted a finger against Soviet claims on Iranian Azerbaijan, being supportive of Soviets on all major issues, including Czechoslovakia in 68, and so on and so forth, including having provided technocrats and the people who repented and went into the high bureaucracy of the Shah's regime. And the claim is that the best place within the Iranian left and the most impressive ones for an observer like him were the Fadayan Khalq organization. And there is an exaggeration that they had brought 100,000 in the streets. This is another report, by the way, of soon after the revolution, 27th of February, 79. And he claims that the Tudeh now has a very united line, blasting in favor of the Islamic Republic. But this was before the return from East Berlin, as you can see, of the Central Committee. As we move in this very chaotic, immediate post-revolution period, the Bahar Azadi, or the Spring of Freedom, we have the progressive sort of change in attitude of the PCI and UNITA in particular with regards to the revolution. When the 8th of March women's demonstration occurs, and here I refer to Nasser Mohajer and Mahnaz Matin's Khizesh Zanan Isfand 57, the view is to defend the whole idea of the chador, and the chador is not seen as a regressive, as an anti sort of female or anti-feminist tool. But by the summer, when 40 newspapers are banned by the authorities, starting from the Oyandegan newspaper, this view changes a lot. And this view changes even more when the Kurdish uprising starts in August of 1979. And there is this idea that the freedoms that people were aspiring for during the revolution are progressively going away. So what goes on with the relationship between the PCI and the Tudeh in this period? So the previous warm times with Iskandari were not replicated under Kianuri. The relationship between Kianuri and the PCI was rather complicated from the start. The first interview that UNITA does with Kianuri is only in September of 1979. So this is a few months after he comes back from exile. And Ginsberg told me in an interview that when he went to talk to Kianuri, the first hour was completely taken away by Kianuri's anger at the rapprochement between the PCI and the Chinese Communist Party. At that point in time, the PCI was opening to the Chinese communists in contravention, of course, of the Soviet line, and Kianuri was very angry about this. And this is how they started, and they really didn't really sort of hit the ground in a good way. And these interviews are very tense. There's a lot of back and forth between Ginsberg and Kianuri. Kianuri at various points accuses Ginsberg of not understanding Iran, not knowing the revolution, when Ginsberg keeps pressing him, and this is September, of course, after the banning of all these newspapers in August of 1979, Ginsberg keeps pressing him on these individual freedoms which are withering away, and this spring of freedom which is progressively dissolving. But Kianuri remains very steadfast in support of Khomeini and the line in favor of Khomeini. So we get to a very important document that I will discuss in a little bit of detail. And this is the secret report that Giancarlo Lannutti, who was a very important figure in the PCI, he was the PCI's point man for maintaining relations with sister organizations in the Middle East and West Asia. He would go and visit Palestinians, Syrians, he would go to Afghanistan, as we'll see, and he ended up in Iran in December of 1979 to meet with Nureddin Kianuri, of course, and with Abdul Rahman Ghassiblu, who was, of course, the long-standing charismatic leader of the Democratic party of Iranian Kurdistan. So the context of this trip isn't very clear. There's not much in the archives. It appears that Tudeh back channels in Italy and Iran organized it. But the broader context is very important because this occurred 5 days following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the assassination, of course, of Hafizullah Amin at the presidential palace in Kabul, as we know. Now, this is important because Lannutti had actually visited Amin in Afghanistan in September, 3 months before, and he had written an extensive report for it on UNITA. And he really sort of defined Amin as one of us, as a Euro-communist, as an affable figure, as somebody who was really in line with what the PG was all about. So, of course, having him assassinated in December wasn't exactly what Lannutti was happy about. So this report starts by saying it all started in rather polemical fashion. Kian Rhee started by asking me whether it was true that the PG had criticized the Soviet invasion. And then he said they were talking in French, which is interesting. C'est dommage. What a pity. Then Kian Rhee says, well, what should the Soviets have done? Leave a country like Afghanistan in the hands of the servants of imperialism. So if you compare the coverage of UNITA and Name Mardom, the Tudeh newspaper in those days, you see where the difference really lies. So the UNITA says Amin was overthrown through a coup d'etat, danger of international consequences. The increased Soviet military presence constitutes an element of, as you can see, an element of friction. Whilst Americans are locked into the confrontation with Iran, of course, the US embassy crisis had just occurred. On the 30th of December, the foreign policy head of the PG has a rally in the city of Bologna, and he says fairly and squarely, the Soviet military intervention cannot be justified. It constitutes an unacceptable violation of the principles of national sovereignty and independence of each country. But in the same days, if you look at Name Mardom, Afghanistan is fulfilling the ideals of the Seoul Revolution of 1978, killing off feudalism, combating world imperialism. On the 29th of December, there is this warm greetings to Barbara Karmal, the new leader of Afghanistan. This idea that Hafizullah Amin had deviated from the path of the revolution, Karmal, and there's no mention of the Soviet intervention here or its importance in the removal of Amin. Nothing, just the idea that there's been this replacement. Another thing that really creates a lot of tension between the two is the US embassy crisis, which of course had erupted on the 4th of November. It was in the thick of it when these two meet. And Lannutti says on the US embassy issue, the Tudeh alignment with Khomeini and the Islamic students is complete. The Tudeh has organized an anti-imperial photo exhibition at the embassy walls, doesn't use communist slogans, and there is this constant accusation by Kian Rhee that UNITA makes use of the term hostages, ostaggi, whereas this is wrong. They should use the term spies rather than hostages. And again, you see the divergences. If you look at UNITA, there's all about hostages and more. And if you look at Mardom, it's all about jasus and the nest of spies. Lastly, the discussion between Lannutti and Kian Rhee had to, of course, focus on Khomeini, who was, of course, the most important political figure in Iran at the time. Kian Rhee here engages in a long expose of the Tudeh line, and Lannutti says this emerged as a total alignment, and I would say completely acritical on the position of Khomeini. We are aligned to the Imam's line. Khomeini's line is progressive, anti-imperialist, revolutionary in content. When asked about the possibility of authoritarianism creeping in and authoritarian regression, Kian Rhee claims that not until Khomeini is around. And he also claims that the Iranian left has not had this level of freedoms in its history. He says that we have never been as free as now. And the counter observation of Lannutti, which wasn't replied by Kian Rhee, was, I would like to be certain that as you would be as free as you are now, had you held a critical line with regards to Khomeini. And Lannutti here sends alarm bells. And he says that the minute Khomeini and his front will cease support for the Tudeh, that's when the Tudeh will be in trouble. And he said this in December of 1979, and it's like a prophecy, because it's exactly more or less what happened in 1983. Kianuri then sends a letter to the Iranian to the PG, and wants another reporter for UNITA. He thinks that Ginsburg isn't good enough. He's being not aligned enough to the Tudeh. He wants somebody that the Tudeh can nurture and influence. Lannuti claims that this letter is absurd. It's a direct result of the attitude that Kianuri has. It effectively places the Tudeh at the mercy of Khomeini's moods and that of the Islamic leadership. There's a claim that the rest of the left, both rigidly Marxist and not, are critical and at times very harshly against the Tudeh, which has once again isolated itself. And he poses the question, why would the masses, the Islamic masses that he's observed in Iran, abandon Khomeini for Kianuri? That's the other question that he poses. I'll finish with the other leg of the strip of Lannuti, his encounter with Qasem-Lu. He goes to Mahabad for this. This is far more congenial. Qasem-Lu explains the Kurdish Democratic Party's line as a national and progressive party. They want self-administration. Qasem-Lu claims that they're not separatists. Many people claim that the Kurdistan Democratic Party was separatist. Qasem-Lu keeps denying it in such encounters. And they want a plurinational Iranian state, which leads to an enrichment of Iranian democracy. And this was really music to the ears of the Euro-communist Pichi at that point in time. And I'll finish with interestingly noting how Lannuti does write, all this was a secret report. Lannuti does write a report for UNITA on his encounter with Qasem-Lu in Mahabad, but doesn't write anything about his encounter with Kianuri. That encounter went so bad that he couldn't salvage anything out of it for a public report for a public audience. So to conclude, the relationship lingers on in 1980-81, but in the summer of 1981, it becomes a real problem as the the opposition groups that are being repressed after the impeachment of Abul Hassan Bani Sadr keep asking for the PG to sever its ties with the Tudeh, because the Tudeh keeps supporting the Islamic Republic throughout the summer and autumn of 1981. So this puts the PG in a very tough bind with regards to the Tudeh, and progressively the relationship sort of frays and withers away at that point in time. So the revolution, therefore, was the sort of incident which caused this very warm relationship between two brotherly parties in the 1970s to change dramatically. And it didn't change for the better. One of the consequences of the rise to power of Kianuri and the line that the Tudeh party had in 1979 and 1980 was precisely the distancing from a party that was progressively moving away in the Berlinguer years from this line of strict adherence to Moscow, or even what Berlinguer called la spinta propulsiva della rivoluzione d'ottobre, the sort of energy caused by the October Revolution. What you see in these writings of both Favre, Nashta, Ginsburg, UNITA, and Lannuti was a high ability to analyze the Iranian left in a very cold-blooded way and make very pertinent and prophetic assessments of the strengths and weaknesses of the Iranian left. So I'll just conclude by saying that besides the analysis of Tudeh-PG relations, this source is also very useful for studying the Iranian left per se. And therefore, it's also very useful for parochial historians like myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Siavush. We'll go straight to the questions. We have quite a lot of questions coming in, and some of them are quite complicated, but I would ask the speakers to keep their responses short as far as possible so that we can deal with as many as we can. First of all, let me pass on a little note from Professor Evan Abrahamian, who just would like to say to Piruz, the first Yadnameh Shahidan by Namvar was published in August 1964. No place of publication is given. So that might be something that needs to be followed up privately. I'll try to summarize some of the questions. The first for Piruz. And someone is asking, since the poem that you mentioned was not by Vakili, can you say something about who did write it, or at least the context of its composition, if you have any information about this?
I do not have any information about that. I imagine someone in the Tudeh party put that together, but I don't have any specific information.
Thank you. Another question on the letters. Someone is asking, where would one be able to find an original copy of the 6 letters that were sent to Turan Mir Hadi that you referred to in your speech?
Right. Let me make sure that I say the name correctly. So the original copies of the first 5 letters, the 6th one was given to Kianuri, and we don't know where that is, but the first 5 letters are deposited in the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, and they are currently there at the Institute under Jafar Vakili papers.
Thank you. A question here for Piruz and Muhajir, or all the panelists. And the questioner asks of martyrdom. Is this an idea or theme that many political groups in Iran use to rally support for their cause? The Fedayeen and Mujahideen Khalq, for example, often appeal to the theme martyrdom as a way to justify the deaths of their members. In your opinion, how interested were and how effective was the Tudeh party in using the notion of martyrdom, especially for its executed military members, to help forward their political agenda? I don't know, would Nasser care to comment on this, perhaps first?
Yes, I from what I understand, even before the emergence of the communist movement in Iran, even at the time of even before the Iranian constitutional revolution, the term martyr was used by democratic forces and anyone who was sacrificing her life for the cause of people, for the cause of Iran, for the cause of change in the country, was considered to be a martyr. And this trend in secularization of the language is something quite recent. There were people, who were trying to, secularize the language, before, even, like in the 20s in Iran, in the 30s in Iran. But, this was, like nothing, very common, nothing very popular. So, the Iranian left, the Iranian democratic forces, the Iranian nationalist forces, they all used the word martyr, okay? And Tudeh party was no exception, the Fedayeen Khalq were no exception. All trends of the Iranian left, were using the term martyr before 1979 revolution. It's after that, and after, our confrontation with Islam, that we start to rethink and try to secularize the language and not use the term martyr. Of course, then, answering the question, the Tudeh party of Iran used this term quite easily at the time.
Would Piruz or Javush care to comment on this question?
So one of the things I noticed, to some extent, part of my talk also refers to that, is this use of these heroes or martyrs for other, to advance the policies of the party, or that has been used, in my view, extensively. Now, Nasser talked about the actual term, or especially because we have a long tradition in Shiite Islam of using martyr. And if you look at the function of martyr of Imam Hussein in that context also, it is very similar how it is used in different contexts. So I feel that it has been used by the Tudeh party, and it looks like it is being used by other left organizations extensively.
Thank you. Siyavush?
I will say very briefly that this concept of martyrdom was very important again in the 60s and 70s, because there were very few actual martyrs, famous martyrs, that political parties could make propaganda use of in their struggle against the Shah. And the Tudeh had the first supply of them after 1953, with the execution, of course, of the first set of military officers, including Jafar Vakili. You have to go to the late 60s and 70s for the start of the other martyrs, like the Mojahids, the Fadois, and more. So by the time you get to 1979, these groups were the only ones that had martyrs. I mean, when the revolution occurs in February 11, 1979, the numbers of Shahid and Shohada, the famous ones, the people who could would be covered by the press and more. If you look at the press, it was only just the leftist and the Mujahid ones. So martyr had a very different meaning at that time with regards to what it became in the past few decades.
Thank you. We have a comment from an anonymous attendee, which I will just summarize because I think it's probably worth hearing. And the person says that the Iranian people can be proud to have these heroes among their sons. One day, these brave patriots will have the popular recognition of the young people of the new generation. But he or she concludes by saying that it is a pity that there is no one from the Central Committee, I presume of the Tudeh party, to tell his or her side of the story, all killed or dead after being imprisoned. I don't know if anyone would care to comment on that. Essentially, this person is saying that there's no one there to defend the record of the Tudeh party. Shall we move on? Question for Nasser. Can you comment on other assassinations attributed to Roozbeh?
Yes. There are directly, it's the case of Lankarani. I could have focused on Lankarani as well instead of Mohammad Masood. We find no clue to think that the Khosrow Roozbeh was involved in that assassination. In fact, that was a big blow to him. When he heard that they were accusing him of killing Lankarani because they had a very close relationship. But other than Lankarani, there were 4 other people who were deserters from the Tudeh party, and they were becoming Savak agents. They were helping Savak to find out who is at large, and members, who were in the underground, or members, who were just trying to hide themselves, in that period of, terror after the coup d'etat of 1953. Okay, it seems to me that, and all the historical documents, all the documents in the Tudeh archives and the Central Committee discussions, also the Executive Committee discussions in Iran, it seems that at one point, okay, one thing I should say first, the Tudeh party, has not talked about its history. And it is very difficult to talk about, the historiography of the Tudeh party. I think no other organization like the Tudeh party has diverted its own history as the Tudeh party. Okay, so we do not know a lot of things about the Tudeh party. Okay, for example, this very thing that you mentioned, or the person who asked this question posed. Okay, at one point it seems that the executive committee of the Tudeh party decided that, in order to stop this trend, and in order to make, people, who were surrendering under torture or pressure to the Savak, in order to stop this process, we should punish and kill some people, so the others, would try not to continue this. This is nothing new, as you know better than me. Like, this happened in France during resistance, this happened in Italy, this happened in Yugoslavia. This is the trend of the time, that, you have these cellules, who would just try to, make this point that, if you continue working with the Savak or the intelligence, or, revealing information about people in the organization, you have to pay for it. Okay. It seems that, the group, the executive committee, who Khosrow Roozbeh was not a part of, decided that they would kill 4 people. Okay. Khosrow Roozbeh probably had a role because, he was under hierarchically speaking, under the executive committee of the Tudeh party, and they were asking, they were telling him that, okay, you have to organize these acts. To what degree he himself, was, involved in these acts, we do not know anything at all. But in terms of, having, being in consensus and, accepting, this decision of the executive committee, there is no doubt that, he accepted this. That is why, for example, in his defense, for so many times he asks, okay, if you think I'm a killer, if you think I was involved in these things, then you must ask, Bahrami, Qureshi, Jodat, people, who were in the executive committee, and now you are in your hands in prison. They should come and they join me in this court and say why they decided to do this. What I was doing was I was listening to the orders of the executive committee. So in this sense, I think that, he had he agreed with this policy of the Tudeh party in terms of killing the 4 people, who were involved, who were working with the Savak and helping the Savak to find out, people who were in the underground at the time. That's my guess.
A question for Siavush. Are you saying the Tudeh compares to ICP? I think that's the Indonesian Communist Party in significance. That was hardly the case, especially in the 1960s, 70s, when the Indonesian Party, early 1960s, or the French and Spanish parties were much more significant. during this time, the Tudeh was a rather insignificant party in exile.
Thanks for the point, Afshin. No, I mean, I think there were two amongst the Tudeh. I don't think was insignificant. I mean, of course, it lacked a mass basis that the other parties did. I mean, you're right. It was an exile in East Germany and more, but the significance I give to the Tudeh is not really mine. It's actually what the Pichi was, the significance that the Pichi was attributing to the Tudeh. So, for example, they get locked into the Khosrow Roozbeh cause when he was still alive and he was arrested in the end of 1957. They published letters regarding him, appeals to save his life. They keep commemorating him throughout the 60s. They keep referring to the struggle of the Tudeh in that period, going all the way from 1951. So at least if you look at the Pichi archives and the party publications, Unità and Rinascita, you see that the Pichi is really attributing significance to them. They have a lot of sympathy for the struggle of the Tudeh. They remain very rigorously and rigidly against the Shah's regime, to the extent that when the Fada'i movements and these other Marxist groups start up in Iran in the early 70s, they're not as sympathetic as other parts of the Italian press. So, for example, the Manifesto newspaper, that it was this independent communist newspaper, is far more sympathetic towards the Fada'is. But I fully agree with you that other non-Eastern Bloc parties were more elaborate than the Tudeh. They were more active than the Tudeh. They had more of a power base. But again, the Pichi was taking the Tudeh very seriously.
I'm afraid I've lost my link.
There's a question by Rowena. It's under Afshin's. Do you see it in the Q&A?
No, I've lost the link entirely. I think I'm going to have to come back in. I don't know what's happened. I've been having these problems. Could you continue?
I'll read it if you want. Yeah, sure. So do you want to go out and in again?
Let me see. I think I may have to.
Okay. I'll just read out I'll deputize for Stephanie while she's going in and out. So apologies, I'm asking a question to myself because that's the next one on the list. By Rowena, I've come across some exchanges between the Tudeh and the Communist Party of Great Britain. Do we know of other links with other Western European left-wing parties? Very good question. I'll say briefly, I believe they are. Unfortunately, due to COVID and other sort of delays, I haven't been able to access archives. I really recommend whoever can do it to go to the French Communist Party archive. It's in Paris. I'm sure that very interesting material will come out of there. And of course, the Communist Party archive at the People's History Museum in Manchester, which I think you've accessed already. Then there is a note by Professor Touraj Atobaki. The poet of Mara Bebous is Haydar Reghabi. This poem had first appeared in Reghabi's collections of poems, Aseman Ashk, published in 1950 by Amir Kabir Publishers in Tehran. Piruz, do you have a comment on that?
No, thank you, Touraj, for that information. So first of all, it shows that it was, because often people have talked about that this was written by an officer of the Tudeh party when they were executed, but given that it's 1950s, so it actually completely puts that out of the picture.
Thank you. I'll keep going until Stephanie is back with us. Nima Mina, Dr. Nima Mira has a note for both Professor Abrahamian and Piruz Vakili. He says that Rahim Namvar's book was published in the Tudeh party's print shop in Pusnek, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in the old GDR district, Bezirk of Gera, which is now Thuringia. And then Professor Abrahamian, on a similar note, says Namwar titled his books on the party heroes as Shahid. Interestingly, Namwar did not come from a Shia family or background. I fully agree with Professor Abramian. He was actually a very prominent Jewish member of the party. Then we have there is a note by Arash Azizi, a question. Thank you for the amazing talk. Did Tudeh send delegations or observers to the PG congresses? And did PG met with Leipzig, Tudeh in Leipzig ever? Yes, I think there were some meetings in Leipzig, but they were kept rather quiet. And the Tudeh, I think, yes, did send delegations or observers to PG congresses. And you can ask for more to Farhad Farjad. Then there is an anonymous attendee that says that attempts were made on behalf of the Central Committee of the Tudeh Party of Iran as early as November 2020 to contribute information or to give its side of the story. An email to this effect was sent to Dr. Siavush Ranjbar Daimi, to which there was no response. I can confirm that I received no email from the Central Committee of the Tudeh Party of Iran as early as November 2020. And had I received it, I would have certainly given opportunity for its side of the story to be told. I never received such an email from any party formation. And we did approach some Tudeh veterans for this party, for this conference, especially, apologies if I digress, but the only person who agreed to appear in this conference was Farhad Farjad, and he did so in the panel on Tuesday. We go back to a question for Nasser Muajer. This is for Mr. Muajer. Are there any historical and clear evidence connecting Massoud's assassination to Fadayan Islam?
I really have not seen anything. The only thing that we know of is like after the Fadayan Islam were arrested, there were a series of articles in Khandaniha and saying that, you know, Nawab Safavi, I mean, they accused Nawab Safavi of many assassinations. And one of the assassinations that they accused him of was the assassination of Muhammad Massoud. But the details of this, I mean, if they were involved in that, you know, we know nothing of. It seems to me that if the Fadayan Islam, my understanding, the way that they operated at the time, the way that they talked about their actions at the time, and they made, you know, big, you know, propaganda about whatever terror they undertook. It seems to me that if it was the work of the Fadayan Islam, they would have, you know, somehow, you know, made it clear, at least in religious milieus, at least amongst their sympathizers, that, you know, they were engaged in this act. Most probably, you know, the assassination of Muhammad Massoud was the work of this is a very peculiar time in Iran, and, you know, a lot of terrors were happening at the time, and the courts, you know, Arfa himself, you know, even Razmara, you know, they had their own, you know, groupings, terror groupings at the time. This is something that, you know, was wide spread at the time. So it seems to me that, you know, by all indications, we can think of, you know, the court to be responsible for the assassination of Muhammad Massoud.
Stephanie, are you back, or should we carry on?
I'm back. Thank you.
Okay.
Question from Arash Azizi to Siavush.
Yes, we replied to that.
You've done that. Okay.
I'm asking the staff whether we have any question left. What about this question by David Mirhadi? did we answer this one? Since it is clear that the poems with which you began are not by Vakili. I think we did, right?
We did have an answer
Okay.
to that, yes.
Okay. I don't think we have any further question left unless I am proven wrong. Does anybody from the audience, we still have a few minutes, we are a bit ahead of time. So if anyone wants to pose further questions, they're welcome to do so in the next couple of minutes or hopefully even earlier than that. Sorry, I'm ending my deputy and chair.
Perhaps the speakers would like a few minutes to summarize their conclusions.
Sorry, we have one which has just come in from Nima Mina for Nasser Mohajer. Do you see it? It's at the very end of the Q&A.
Yes. Who were the other members of the assassination committee apart from Abu Hassan Abbasi? Were Ashot Shabazian, Leipzig, and Kazem Nadim, East Berlin, part of this committee? Did the affected families try to take legal action against individuals or against the party after 1979? Question from Nasser.
Kazem and Nadim and who?
Ashot Shabazian.
Ashut Shahbazian, yes.
So he's asking, who were the other members of the committee apart from Abu Hassan Abbasi? And he gives, were Ashot Shabazian from Leipzig, and Kazem Nadim, East Berlin, part of this committee? Did the affected families try to take legal action against individuals or against the party after 1979?
Well, it seems that, Abbasi, played a role in many of the assassinations. And well, Abbasi is the person who broke down in jail and, decided to work with Savak, of the Farmandari Nizami at the time, the military command at the time, before the creation of Savak. And Abbasi played a very important role, after, he repented in terms of talking about a lot of the things that, and making up stories too at the same time, both, revealing certain truths and at the same time, making stories that that Savak wanted, to make at the time. So, but we know that Abbasi, for example, was engaged in some of the killings that I said, about, members of the Tudeh party who had changed side. I have heard, we do not know the proceedings of the fourth plenum as such, okay? This is something that the Tudeh party, does not talk about. So it is very, very, very difficult to talk, based on solid documents. Based on solid documents, we cannot really come to solid conclusions. But something that we know is that, in the fourth plenum, some people who were engaged in the terror group of the Tudeh party talked, and they revealed certain information. It also seems to me that, the fourth plenum, they decided that, we are not going to talk about this in the public. What happens in the fifth plenum is that they decide, because, the fifth plenum is right after, Osmudeh comes in 1957, and talks about the terrors. So the Central Committee of the Tudeh party, they decide to, they write a declaration, a polemical declaration, trying to refute, everything that, Osmudeh says, But at the same time, they decide amongst themselves to make truth commissions and go and look into these acquisitions. Okay. After the resolution, they were supposed to talk about this, in the next plenum. And what happens is that in the very document that we have of the 5th plenum, saying that we are going to look into these killings by a truth commission, there is a footnote. And the footnote says very clearly that our findouts would not be completely announced or made for the public, okay, because of security concerns. So to this date, we cannot really talk about, with certitude about what has happened, and what is, this chapter of the Tudeh party when they decide, the executive committee inside Iran, when they decide, to get engaged in certain acts of terror. And this is very clearly, it is totally different from, the terrors that happened before. Okay, we cannot talk much, with certainty. I don't know if I answered Nima's question or not. Kazem Nadim was one of the people that I have heard. I mean, these are the things that you hear. Kazem Nadim is one of the people that I have heard that, talked in the plenum and talked about, his involvement with the terror committee. Ashut Shahbazian was mentioned as a member of the terror committee.
Thank you. I think we have no more questions. In that case, if there are no more questions, would the panelists care to take a few minutes to summarize their conclusions after this discussion? Perhaps if we ask Piruz first of all, if there is anything further you'd like to add after these questions have been asked?
Sure, it feels like harping on the same theme, but there were two things that I did not get to mention as I was doing, as my time was running out. So there was, I said that there were 4 periods of time. And so first of all, again, it's minor, but at the same time revealing that when in Nameh Mardom to the party talked about the letters and essentially said that except for the one sent to Central Committee, all of the others are fake. They also referred to Turani Mirhadi as the previous wife of Jafar Vakili, which suggests that they may have nullified that relationship after Jafar Vakili was executed. So it was just an odd reference, but essentially they wanted to say, don't listen to her. So they made her ex-wife of Jafar Vakili and listen to us. So, and then finally in June of 2017, this is a year after Turani Mirhadi passed away, there was a long and laudatory article about Turani Mirhadi. At that time, by that time, she was a national figure in area of education in Iran, and especially children's education and children's literature. So they had this long article talking about Comrade Turani Mirhadi, the mother of modern education in Iran, on the occasion of 90th year of his birth. And in that, again, I looked at that article, and in that, again, the same thing. So I'm going to just quote 2 lines from that. What more than anything influenced her social and political character was his introduction to and relation with Major Jafar Vakili. It is thus that she chose the path of the Tudeh party, the party of the working class of Iran, and remained faithful to its ideals to the end of her life. In fact, people contacted her after Iranian Revolution. She declined to join the party, and she essentially limited her activities in the area of culture and education, and she never joined the party. So again, another mischaracterization in 2017. So I'll stop here.
Thank you. Nasser, would you?
Well, I would like to mention 2 things. One is that it has to do with sources about Khosrow Roozbeh. And his last defense, you know, by all accounts, Roozbeh defended very bravely his ideas in the court. And his last defense was smuggled out of Iran and was published in, if I'm not mistaken, if it was published in 1956 outside of Iran. And I'm sorry, this is 1343, which is 66 outside of Iran. This is a very important source. And Khosrow Roozbeh, when he was arrested, you know, he declines to answer any questions under pressure, under torture. But after a while, you know, they make him aware that, you know, they know everything about, you know, the activities of the Tudeh party. Bahrami, a member of the Central Committee, Qureshi, another member of the Central Committee, they had talked extensively about everything. And Abbasi too, you know, all these people, they had talked about, you know, the details, you know, of the activities of the Tudeh party. So there is this famous sentence by Khosrow Roozbeh, because he decides to take all the responsibilities in order to defend the honor of the Tudeh party. He decides to take a lot of responsibilities that, you know, he had nothing to do with him. So there is a famous sentence by him. He says that there are times that, you know, you should not say a word. There are times that you should say everything. And Abbasi was supposed not to say a word. I am supposed to say everything. And his defense, of course, is a vehement, you know, defense of the Tudeh party, the historical role of the Tudeh party, of Marxism, of Leninism, of the ideas of change and the revolution in Iran, refutation of the monarchy, everything. I mean, he doesn't budge in his last defense. Okay, this the last defense has not been. I mean, there is references to it here and there, but this is not the main text that people go to when they talk about Khosrow Roozbeh. The main text is Zibai. Communism is in Iran. Okay, no one has seen the interrogations, handwritten interrogations as of now. Just the little pieces that we saw in Etila'at that are not Khosrow Roozbeh's writing. The Islamic Republic of Iran has treated, you know, the Islamic Republic of Iran has published many books on everything, you know, they have read, they have made their own, you know, version of history. But when it comes to Khosrow Roozbeh, nothing. They have never, you know, tried to make this public, you know, the interrogations and make it clear. And this is without any reason. Even, you know, just a few months ago, there was a book published in Iran mimicking the name the Khosrow Roozbeh picked for his book, اطاعت کورکورانه, blind obedience. It calls ارادت کورکورانه, loyal obedience. And it's interesting. It's this is not the only book that they have published in recent years. Every year, for his anniversary or other occasions, they publish something about Khosrow Roozbeh, portraying him as an assassin, as a killer, as an adventurist. And so I think that, that this is the point that I wanted to make is that it is very important for scholars and for researchers, to be very careful with interrogations. These interrogations cannot be relied upon. The interrogations that we see in the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Khatirat Kianiri for that matter, it is, the precedence was made, during in Savak and with Zibai, and they can just change. With interrogations, if you want as a historian, as a researcher, to make this the basis of your work, you can find anything in these interrogations. They can just say anything about the person, who is in their hands, and just make history as they wish.
Thank you. Siavush, if you'd like to sum up, I think there was also a question that perhaps we didn't answer, which was whether any current members of the Tudeh party had been invited.
We answered that earlier on air.
Oh, you did.
No, it's a bit late. I rest my case, and we need to get ready for the next panel in 50 minutes, both audience and attendees. So I think it's best that I do not make any comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, let me just thank the participants, Jafar Vakili, Nasser Mohajer, and Siavush, for what I think will be an extremely important panel when the material is published, and I look forward to reading more detail. And thank you to Siavush for organizing this, and to the student helpers, and also to the participants, the attendees who's given their time this afternoon. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the next session. Thank you.
I also want to thank you and the team that
Thank you. Yes.
organizing this fabulous session.